The silence of the alleyway behind Amara Bennett's apartment was broken by a sound that didn't belong in the night, a heavy, wet thud followed by a groan that sounded like a man losing a fight with the Reaper. Amara stopped mid-step, her key frozen in the lock. She had lived in this part of the city long enough to know the golden rule: eyes down, ears closed, heart locked. But the trail of blood glistening under the flickering street lamp wasn't just a warning, it was a plea. When she looked down, she didn't see a threat. She saw a man in a white dress shirt turned a violent, sickening crimson, slumped against her trash bins. His tattoos, black ink coiling around his neck like a serpent, signaled a life of sin, but the way he clutched his side signaled a life that was slipping away. Amara should have called the police. She should have let the sirens handle the mess. Instead, the nurse in her, the part of her that couldn't let a life extinguish on her watch, took over. She didn't just open her door, she opened her life to a hurricane. If you're addicted to stories where the most dangerous man on earth meets the one woman who isn't afraid of him, make sure to like this video and subscribe. This is the ruthless mafia boss was shot and left for dead. Let's dive in. Amara Bennett was the daughter of a woman who had survived 3 recessions and a neighborhood that tried to swallow them whole. She wasn't built for the delicate or the faint of heart. Growing up with a mother who worked triple shifts at the factory, Amara learned that a black woman's greatest weapon was her competence. She had studied by candlelight when the power was cut, fought for every credit in nursing school, and finally earned the blue scrubs she now wore, scrubs that were currently stained with the blood of a man who looked like he could order a hit as easily as a cup of coffee. She looked at him now, sprawled across her small, neat living room. This apartment was her sanctuary, a place she'd scrubbed and painted with her own 2 hands to make it feel safe. Now the air smelled of gunpowder and expensive, metallic blood. He was breathtaking in the way a loaded gun is breathtaking, all sharp edges and lethal promise. His hair was disheveled, falling over a brow that remained furrowed even in his stupor. She knew she was likely harboring a monster, but as she reached for her medical kit, all she saw was a patient who wouldn't see the sunrise without her. "Don't die on my rug," Amara muttered, pulling on her gloves. "I just got the deposit back on this place." She had seen trauma before in the ER, but the bullet wound in his ribs was jagged and angry. As she pressed the antiseptic-soaked gauze to his ribs, the man's body didn't just flinch, it coiled. Seung-jin's eyes snapped open. They weren't the eyes of a victim. They were dark, alert, and filled with a terrifying, obsidian-sharp awareness. Before she could breathe, his hand, large, scarred, and strong, clamped around her wrist. The strength in his grip, despite the blood loss, made her heart hammer against her ribs. "Who are you?" His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, heavily accented and dripping with a cold authority that didn't belong in a 1-bedroom apartment. "The person making sure you don't bleed out," Amara said, her voice trembling only slightly. She refused to look away. "You're in my home. You were dying in my alley. Now let go of my hand so I can finish cleaning this, or I'll leave you to the vultures." Seung-jin's eyes stared at her, his intense gaze raking over her blue scrubs and the steady set of her shoulders. He saw the compassion in her eyes, but he also saw the defiance. For a man who had spent his life being feared or betrayed, the sight of a woman who offered him neither was a shock to his system. "You should have let me go," he whispered, his grip loosening just a fraction, his eyes never leaving hers. "You saving me is the most dangerous thing you've ever done." "I've lived in this city my whole life," Amara countered, pressing the gauze back down with a firm professional snap. "I'm not afraid of the dark, Mr. Park. Now stay still." Surprise flickered in Seung-jin's eyes, followed by a flicker of something much more dangerous: obsession. The transition from the rain-slicked alley to the harsh, artificial glow of the kitchen light was a blur of adrenaline and straining muscles. Seung-jin was a dead weight of muscle and expensive silk, his breath hitching in wet, shallow gasps that told Amara his lung was dangerously close to collapsing. She kicked her kitchen chairs aside, cleared the mail and a half-eaten bag of chips from the table with one frantic sweep of her arm, and eased him onto the hard surface. The ruthless boss of the city's most feared syndicate was currently a broken man on a Formica tabletop. But even as his life leaked out of him, his eyes never truly closed. They tracked her, obsidian shards filled with a primal, wary intelligence. "Don't call anyone," he rasped, the words bubbling through the crimson staining his lips. "If I call the police, you die. If I call your friends, I die," Amara countered, her voice dropping into the professional rhythmic clip she used in the trauma ward. "I'm choosing a third option. Now shut up and let me work." She didn't have a surgical suite, but she had a decade of survival and a stolen stash of medical supplies she kept for the neighborhood's off-the-books emergencies. She tore open his shirt, the pearl buttons scattering across her linoleum floor like tiny, discarded teeth. Beneath the silk, his body was a map of violence, old scars intersecting with the fresh, jagged hole in his side. The black ink of his tattoos seemed to writhe as his chest heaved. Amara moved with the clinical grace of a woman who had mastered the art of staying calm while the world screamed. She doused her hands in high-proof rubbing alcohol, the sting a sharp reminder of the stakes. She prepped the local anesthetic, her needle steady as she numbed the area around the entry wound. Seung-jin didn't flinch. His jaw remained clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek, but his gaze remained fixed on her face. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her natural curls were pulled back in a practical puff, and the unwavering steady set of her mahogany-skinned hands. No one had ever looked at him this way, not as a king, not as a monster, but as a puzzle to be solved, a life to be mended. "You're too good for this place," he whispered, a grimace of agony twisting his handsome features as she began the delicate process of debriding the wound. "And you're too expensive to be dying in it," Amara replied, not looking up. "Focus on breathing, Mr. Park. I need to get the debris out before the infection takes what the bullet missed." The clink of her metal forceps against the porcelain bowl she used to catch the shrapnel was the only sound in the small apartment. For Amara, it was a battle for a heartbeat. For Seung-jin, it was a revelation. He felt the phantom heat of her proximity, the quiet compassion in her touch that felt more addictive than the morphine she eventually pushed into his vein. As she began to suture the skin with neat military-grade stitches, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a heavy, charged intimacy in its wake. Amara wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with her shoulder, finally meeting his gaze. She saw the pain there, yes, but she also saw a dawning, dangerous fascination. He wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a man who had seen her at her most powerful, and in the silent code of the underworld, that meant he belonged to her or she to him. "There," she breathed, taping the final bandage into place. "You're lucky. It grazed the rib and missed the lung. But you move and you'll tear every bit of my hard work apart." Seung-jin reached out, his hand trembling but firm as he caught the hem of her blue scrub top. "You saved me, Nurse Bennett," he murmured, his voice a low, possessive hum that sent a shiver down her spine. "In my world, that makes you the most dangerous woman in the city." The 3 days that followed were a slow, simmering siege of Amara's sanity. Her small apartment, once a carefully curated sanctuary of lavender candles and medical textbooks, now felt like a cage containing a restless predator. Seung-jin had graduated from the kitchen table to her velvet sofa, and with every hour that his fever receded, his lethality returned. He was no longer a patient, he was an occupant. He sat reclined against her decorative pillows, his bare chest still wrapped in the crisp white bandages Amara changed every 6 hours. The sight of him there, inked skin against her soft furniture, a ruthless Mafia king in a space built for a quiet nurse, was a constant, jarring friction. He didn't just sit in the room, he dominated it. His presence was a heavy, magnetic pull that drew her eyes, even when she tried to focus on her charting. "You're pacing again, Amara," he noted, his voice regaining its smooth, whiskey-aged richness. He didn't look up from the burner phone one of his men had surreptitiously dropped into her mailbox that morning. "I'm not pacing, I'm cleaning," she countered, aggressively organizing a spice rack that was already perfect. "You're vibrating with the need to be back at the hospital, where you can control the chaos," Seung-jin said, his dark eyes finally lifting to track her. He watched the way her blue scrubs moved over her frame, his gaze lingering with a heat that felt more invasive than a touch. "Here, I am the chaos, and you can't decide if you want to fix me or fear me." Amara stopped, a jar of cinnamon clutched in her hand. "What I want is for you to follow your post-op instructions. You're supposed to be resting, not running an empire from my couch." Seung-jin let out a low, dry chuckle that sent a thrum of electricity through the air. He stood up, slower than usual, but with a terrifying grace that made Amara realize just how much power he had been hiding behind his injury. He walked toward the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under a weight that felt heavier than any man she'd ever known. He stopped just inches from her, effectively pinning her against the counter without ever touching her. He reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder as he picked up her favorite mug, the one she used every morning. He examined it as if it were a piece of evidence. "This is mine now," he murmured, his voice dropping into that possessive low-frequency hum. "This room, this air, even the rhythm of your heart when I walk into the room, it all belongs to the man you saved." "I saved a patient," Amara whispered, her chin tilting up in defiance, even as her pulse betrayed her. "Don't mistake my mercy for a surrender." Seung-jin leaned in, the scent of his expensive cologne now mixed with the medicinal tang of her antiseptic. He placed the mug back on the counter, his thumb grazing the back of her hand with a deliberate, slow pressure that made her breath hitch. It was a claim. He was marking his territory, turning her home into his stronghold and her life into his obsession. "In my world, Amara, mercy is the same as a blood oath," he whispered, his eyes dark with a dawning, dangerous hunger. "You kept me alive. Now I have to decide what to do with the woman who knows what I look like when I'm broken." The intimacy was suffocating and electric, a silent acknowledgement that the walls of her apartment could no longer protect her from the man she had brought inside. He was the lion in her kitchen, and he was no longer interested in the exit. The fourth day didn't arrive with the sun. It arrived with the low, ominous rumble of 3 black SUVs idling at the curb of her narrow street. Amara was in the kitchen, the scent of morning coffee providing a thin veil of normalcy, when she saw Seung-jin's posture change. He didn't just sit up, he became a coiled spring, his eyes fixed on the door with a chilling, predatory focus. "They're here," he said, his voice a low vibration that made the china in her cabinets rattle. "The ones who shot you?" Amara asked, her heart leaping into her throat. She instinctively reached for the heavy cast-iron skillet on the stove, but Seung-jin's hand was already on her arm, pulling her back. "No," he murmured, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second as it met hers. "The ones who will kill anyone standing between me and them." A heavy rhythmic thud echoed against the door, not the frantic scratching of a dying man, but the authoritative strike of someone who expected the world to move out of his way. Amara didn't wait for him to ask. She stood her ground, smoothing her blue scrubs and drawing a breath of steel her grandmother had left in her bones. She opened the door just as far as the security chain allowed. Standing in the hallway was a man who looked like he had been carved out of obsidian. Ryu Sang-ho, Seung-jin's right-hand man, didn't blink. His suit was worth more than Amara's entire education, and the cold, flat stare behind his designer glasses suggested he'd already calculated 3 different ways to clear the room. Behind him stood Baek Jin-woo and Jin-woo Tae, their hands hovering near the lapels of their jackets with a practiced, lethal readiness. "Step aside, Miss Bennett," Sang-ho said, his voice a polished blade. "We are here for the chairman." "I don't know who you are, and I don't care about a chairman," Amara countered, her voice steady even as her pulse drummed against her ears. "I have a patient in a delicate post-operative state. This is a sterile environment, and you're currently a walking infection risk. No one enters this apartment until I say so." Jin-woo moved to shoulder the door, his expression darkening, but Sang-ho held up a hand. He looked at Amara, really looked at her, seeing the bloodstains on her cuffs and the lack of fear in her mahogany eyes. "He is bleeding," Sang-ho stated, a test hidden in the observation. "He was bleeding," Amara corrected. "I spent 6 hours pulling shrapnel out of his ribs while you were wherever it is people like you go when things get messy. He's stable, he's resting, and if you barge in there with your guns and your chaos, you'll undo everything I've done to keep his heart beating. Now you can wait in the hall like civilized men, or you can call an ambulance and explain to the police why a chairman is leaking on a nurse's linoleum." A tense, heavy silence stretched across the threshold. The enforcers looked at each other, stunned by the audacity of the woman in the faded blue scrubs. Then, from the shadows of the living room, Seung-jin's voice rang out, amused and terrifyingly proud. "Let them in, Amara. They've passed your inspection." As Amara unlatched the chain, Sang-ho stepped inside, dipping his head in a microscopic show of respect as he passed her. He walked straight to the sofa, dropping to one knee before the man she only knew as her patient. "Chairman Park," Sang-ho murmured. "The traitors have been located. The city is waiting for your return." Amara stood by the door, her hand still on the handle, watching the lion in her kitchen receive his subjects. She finally knew his name, Park Seung-jin, and with it came the realization that her small apartment was no longer a sanctuary, it was a war room. She had proven her loyalty to a man she didn't know, and as Seung-jin looked at her over the heads of his kneeling soldiers, his dark eyes carried a silent, binding oath. She had protected him, and now the entire weight of his empire would be used to ensure she never walked away. The presence of the 3 men in the small living room transformed the apartment's air into something heavy and metallic, like the moments before a summer thunderstorm. Ryu Sang-ho and the others stood like statues of granite, their eyes scanning the windows and walls with a professional paranoia that made Amara's skin crawl. She stayed in the kitchen, her back against the counter, her blue scrubs feeling like a thin, fragile shield against the reality of the names Sang-ho had just uttered. Seung-jin gestured for Sang-ho to stand. The movement was stiff, and a flicker of pain crossed his face, but his voice was absolute. "Tell me the extent of the rot," Sang-ho reported, his head bowed. "It was Jin-woo's cousin, Tae-hyun. He collaborated with the rival Dongsun syndicate. They didn't just want you dead, Chairman. They wanted to absorb our port holdings. They believe that without you, the inner circle will crumble into infighting. They've already seized 2 of the warehouses." Seung-jin's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked at Amara, and for the first time the growing fascination in his gaze was tempered by a dark, simmering guilt. "And the leak, how did they find the safe house?" "A bridesmaid's betrayal, essentially," Sang-ho replied, glancing briefly at Amara. "Everyone who knew your location that night has been handled, except for the person who actually found you. The Dongsun scouts saw the blood trail leading towards this block. They don't know which door yet, but they're combing the neighborhood." The realization hit Amara like a physical blow. The price of mercy wasn't just a threat to her peace, it was a target painted on her back. By dragging a dying king into her home, she hadn't just saved a life, she had joined a war. "You mean they're coming here?" Amara asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the ice flooding her veins. Seung-jin stood up, ignoring the protest of his bandaged ribs. He walked toward her, his presence closing the distance until the heat of his body radiated against her scrubs. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his fingers finally brushed her temple, tucking a loose curl back into her puff. "I am the chairman of the Shin Yen Group, Amara," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly confession. "To my enemies, I am a god to be toppled. To my men, I am the law, and to the people who tried to kill me, you are now my greatest weakness. They saw me fall, but they didn't see me die. They will look for the woman who performed the miracle." Amara looked at the men in the suits, then back at the man with the obsidian eyes. "I'm a nurse. I work 12-hour shifts and I worry about my student loans. I don't belong in a ledger of assets and weaknesses." "You belong to that world the moment you put your hands on my heart," Seung-jin countered, his grip on her arm tightening with a possessive urgency. "You gave me back my life. Now that life belongs to you, but the danger comes with the title. Sang-ho has already secured the perimeter, but we cannot stay here. If they find you in this apartment, they won't just kill you, they will use you to make me crawl." The gravity of the situation settled over her. She looked around her sanctuary, the lavender candles, the worn medical books, the rug she'd saved for months to buy. It was all a target now. By being an alleyway angel, she had forfeited her anonymity. "Pack a bag," Seung-jin ordered, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that promised both protection and a beautiful, terrifying captivity. "Only the essentials. From this moment on, your old life is over. You saved a monster, Amara. Now you have to live with him." The move to the penthouse happened under the cover of a torrential downpour, a tactical blur of screeching tires and silent, stone-faced men. The new space was a fortress of glass and steel perched high above the city's grime, overlooking a kingdom that looked peaceful only from a distance. But inside the master suite, the air remained thick with the same suffocating electric tension that had started in Amara's kitchen. Seung-jin sat on the edge of the sprawling king-sized bed, his silhouette framed by the lightning flickering over the skyline. He had refused to let the private doctors Sang-ho summoned touch him. He would only allow Amara. "The stitches are holding, but the skin around them is irritated," Amara murmured, her voice soft in the dim light of the room. She was kneeling between his legs, her hands steady as she worked to clean the area around his wound. She had traded her blood-stained scrubs for a silk robe Seung-jin's staff had provided, and the friction of the fabric against her skin made her hyper-aware of her own body in the quiet room. Seung-jin didn't answer. His hands rested on his knees, his knuckles white. The local anesthetic had worn off hours ago, and the raw, unadulterated pain was back, etching deep lines of exhaustion into his handsome face. As Amara applied a soothing ointment, a sharp hiss of air escaped his teeth, and his hand instinctively shot out, gripping her shoulder to steady himself. "I'm sorry," Amara whispered, looking up. "I know it hurts." "It's not the wound that's hurting me, Amara," he rasped, his eyes locking onto hers with a feverish, desperate intensity. The lethal awareness was still there, but it was being eclipsed by a raw, human hunger. He reached out with the other hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his tongue grazing her lower lip. Amara froze. She should have pulled back. She should have reminded him of the boundaries of her profession, of the savior complex that had landed her in this gilded cage. But the heat radiating from him was a magnetic force she couldn't resist. In the hospital, patients were numbers, cases, and tasks. Here, Seung-jin was a storm she wanted to be caught in. "You've spent days looking at me like I'm a broken machine you need to fix," Seung-jin whispered, his hand sliding into the curls at the nape of her neck, pulling her inches closer. "Look at me now. Tell me what you see." "I see a man who shouldn't be sitting up," she breathed, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Lie to me again," he challenged, his voice dropping into that dark, possessive hum. Amara didn't lie. She leaned forward, closing the final inch between them. The kiss was a collision, not the gentle, tentative start of a romance, but a desperate, semi-sexually charged claim. It tasted of copper, expensive whiskey, and the frantic need for life that only comes after staring into the abyss of death. Seung-jin groaned into her mouth, his fingers tangling in her hair as he pulled her up onto the bed with him, his strength returning in a surge of pure, unadulterated obsession. The sanctuary of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden haunting silence of the security feed. Amara was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the silk of her robe still cool against skin that burned from Seung-jin's touch, when she noticed the perimeter lights on the terrace flicker and die. The city below continued to pulse with indifferent neon, but inside the glass walls, the air turned predatory. Seung-jin was on his feet before the first alert reached his burner phone. His movements were stiff, his bandages pulling against fresh stitches, but the lethal awareness had returned with a vengeance. He didn't reach for a robe, he reached for the suppressed handgun resting on the nightstand. "Amara, get behind the reinforced door in the dressing room, now," he commanded, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "What's happening?" she whispered, her hands shaking as she clutched the lapels of her robe. "The shadow has found us," he replied, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door. Jin Woo-tae didn't just find the location, he found a way past the encryption. He's not here to talk, he's here to ensure the chairman stays dead. A muffled thump echoed from the foyer, the unmistakable sound of a breach. Amara didn't have time to be afraid. As a nurse, you knew that in a crisis, you didn't panic, you moved. But as she turned to obey, the bedroom door was kicked open with a violent force that sent wood splinters flying like shrapnel. Jin Woo-tae stepped into the room, flanked by two gunmen. He wasn't the loyal soldier he had pretended to be in the alleyway. He looked like a man who had already tasted the crown. His gaze bypassed Seung-jin and landed on Amara, a cruel, mocking smile twisting his lips. So the rumors were true. The great Park Seung-jin was saved by a little nurse from the slums. You've grown sentimental, Chairman. It's made you slow. I've grown patient, Woo-tae, he countered, his thumb clicking the safety off. A mistake you won't live to regret. The room exploded into a chaotic strobe of gunfire and shattered glass. Seung-jin lunged for Amara, his body acting as a human shield as he pushed her toward the service elevator hidden behind a decorative screen. The sheer force of his protection was overwhelming. He took the brunt of the glass shards, his bare back a canvas of fresh cuts as he returned fire with a surgical, terrifying precision. "Go! Down to the garage! Sang-ho is waiting!" Seung-jin roared over the ringing in her ears. Amara stumbled into the elevator, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched through the closing slits as Seung-jin stood his ground, a wounded lion defending his mate against the hyenas. The elevator descended into the dark underbelly of the building, dropping her into a world where the laws of medicine and mercy no longer applied. When the doors opened, Ryu Sang-ho was there, his engine idling in a blacked-out sedan that looked like an armored beast. He grabbed Amara by the arm, throwing her into the back seat just as Seung-jin emerged from the stairwell, his white bandages now soaked through with fresh, dark blood. He dived in beside her, the car roaring to life and screaming out of the garage before the first of the rival SUVs could block the exit. They disappeared into the city's labyrinthine tunnels, leaving the luxury of the heights for the safety of the shadows. Amara looked at her hands. They were covered in Seung-jin's blood again, but this time she wasn't just fixing a patient, she was running for her life with a man who had made her his entire world, and the traitor's shadow was only the beginning of the hunt. The safe house was a brutalist concrete structure hidden beneath a decommissioned textile factory, a stark contrast to the glass heights they had fled. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, silent tension of men prepared for war. Park Seung-jin did not enter the room as a recovering patient. He moved with a dark, deliberate gravity, his presence commanding the space even as his fresh stitches pulled beneath his silk shirt. Behind him, Amara felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes, the Shadow Council, the architects of the city's underworld. They were men of iron and ice, their faces hardened by decades of blood and betrayal. As they stood around a massive steel table, their gaze shifted from their chairman to the woman in the borrowed silk dress at his shoulder. The confusion in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Chairman, one of the elders, a man with white hair and a jagged scar across his throat, spoke with a raspy skepticism. "We were told the Dong Sun had breached your perimeter. We did not expect you to return with guests." Seung-jin didn't take his seat at the head of the table. He stood, his hand finding the small of Amara's back, a gesture that was both a shield and a claim. The possessive heat of his palm burned through the silk. "This is Amara Bennett," Seung-jin announced, his voice a low, resonant baritone that silenced the room. "She is the reason I am standing before you. She pulled the lead from my ribs while the rest of you were debating my succession." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the council. To these men, a woman like Amara, a commoner from a neighborhood they viewed only as territory, was a non-entity. She was supposed to be a footnote, a temporary fix, not a presence at the high table of the Xinyin group. "She is a civilian," another member spat, his eyes raking over Amara with a dismissive cruelty. "Her presence here is a breach of protocol. She knows our faces, Chairman. She knows too much to be allowed to walk away." Seung-jin's grip on Amara's waist tightened, and the lethal awareness in his eyes flared into a cold, murderous fire. He leaned forward, the shadows of the room dancing over his sharp jawline. "She is not a guest, and she is certainly not a liability. Amara Bennett is under my personal protection. From this moment on, her word carries the weight of my own. If any of you look at her with anything less than the respect you owe me, you will answer to Sang-ho's blade or mine." The silence that followed was absolute. Amara felt the shift in the atmosphere. The pure, unadulterated hunger for power in the room was suddenly tempered by a new, sharp fear. She stood tall, her mahogany skin glowing under the harsh industrial lights, her chin tilted in the same defiance she had shown in the alleyway. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was being forged into a queen in a furnace of secrets. "The Dong Sun think I am weak because I was shot," Seung-jin continued, his gaze sweeping the council until every man lowered his eyes. "They think they can hunt the woman who saved me. They are wrong. We are not just going to defend, we are going to dismantle them. Amara stays by my side. She is the only person in this city I trust with my life, which makes her the most powerful person in this room." He turned to Amara, his expression softening for a heartbeat in a way that only she could see. It was a silent apology and a renewed vow. He wasn't just introducing her to his empire, he was anchoring his empire to her. The warehouse at the edge of the old port district was a cathedral of rusted iron and freezing rain, the air vibrating with the concussive rhythm of heavy-caliber gunfire. This was the final stand, the moment where the rot of the Dong Sun syndicate was to be purged. Seung-jin moved like a shadow through the chaos, his suppressed weapon barking with a lethal rhythmic finality. But the battle came with a steep price, a sudden sharp explosion explosion near the loading docks sent a shockwave through the concrete floor. Amara, crouched behind an armored SUV under Seung-jin's strict orders, saw the secondary blast catch Ryu Sang-ho as he moved to flank the traitors. The obsidian-sharp enforcer was thrown backward, his body crashing into a stack of wooden crates with a sickening crunch. "Sang-ho is down," Jinwoo's voice cracked over the comms, a rare note of panic from the stone-faced soldier. Amara didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for the gunfire to stop. The savior complex that had brought her to Seung-jin's side now drove her into the line of fire. She grabbed her trauma bag, the one Seung-jin had insisted be stocked with the best surgical tools money could buy, and sprinted across the open concrete. "Amara, get back!" Seung-jin's roar echoed through the warehouse, but she was already kneeling in the blood and dust beside Sang-ho. The enforcer was gray, his breath coming in the wet, gurgling rasps of a tension pneumothorax. Shrapnel had pierced his chest, and his lung was collapsing. He looked up at Amara, his flat, lethal eyes now clouded with the haze of approaching death. He tried to push her away, his hand feebly grabbing her arm. "Leave me. Save the chairman." "Shut up, Sang-ho," Amara snapped, her voice cutting through the sounds of war with a cold professional authority. "The chairman is fine. You're the one currently dying on my watch, and I don't lose patience." With steady, mahogany-skinned hands, she tore open his tactical vest. The wound was sucking air, a lethal hiss that signaled his seconds were numbered. She didn't have a hospital, but she had the final remedy of her training. She grabbed a large-bore needle, sterilized it with a quick snap of an alcohol prep pad, and looked Sang-ho in the eye. "This is going to hurt," she warned. She drove the needle into the second intercostal space of his chest. A hiss of trapped air whistled out, a morbid, beautiful sound of relief. Sang-ho's chest rose in a jagged, deep gasp as the pressure on his heart relented. She didn't stop there. She worked with a frenetic, clinical precision, packing the shrapnel wounds and applying occlusive dressings while bullets sparked off the metal crates just feet away. By the time Seung-jin and the remaining loyalists cleared the floor, the traitors dead or fleeing into the night, they found Amara covered in Sang-ho's blood, her hands firmly pressing down on his femoral artery to stem a secondary bleed. The Shadow Council members who had survived the skirmish stood in the flickering light, watching the commoner they had dismissed. They saw the blood on her face and the unwavering steel in her gaze. Sang-ho, the man who had been a ghost of death for the Mafia, reached out and gripped Amara's blood-stained hand, not in acclaim, but in a gesture of profound, undying respect. Seung-jin approached them, his own weapon lowered, his obsidian eyes burning with a pride so intense it felt like a physical heat. He looked at Sang-ho, then at the woman who had once again played God in the shadows. The alleyway angel had not just saved the king, she had saved his sword. And in that moment, the Mafia's respect was no longer a request, it was her birthright. The transition from the blood-slicked concrete of the warehouses to the sterile, gleaming glass of the Bennett Park Trauma Center was a journey paved with a different kind of steel. 1 year later, the city of Chicago didn't just recognize Amara Bennett as a survivor, they recognized her as the most powerful force in urban healthcare. The poor nurse had become a visionary, her blue scrubs replaced by tailored lab coats that still carried the same focused authority she had possessed in her tiny kitchen. The grand opening of the center was a spectacle of high society and hard-earned redemption. Cameras flashed and donors whispered, but Amara moved through the crowd with the same rhythmic, clinical grace that had once saved a dying king. She stood before the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the morning sun reflecting off the mahogany tones of her skin. She didn't look like a woman who had been used as collateral, she looked like the architect of a new world. "We don't just treat wounds here," Amara said, her voice steady and resonant, carrying to the back of the crowded lobby. "We treat the people the rest of the world has forgotten. This center is built on the belief that everyone deserves a second chance at life, no matter where they were found or what shadows they've walked through." Far in the back of the room, positioned in the deepest shadows near the marble pillars, stood Park Seung-jin. He was no longer a ghost of the underworld, but a man who had burned the book on his former life. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his black suit was a masterpiece of custom tailoring, hiding the faint silver lines of scars that Amara had personally stitched. He didn't speak to the press or shake hands with the politicians. He simply watched her. His lethal awareness had transformed into a protective, legitimate devotion. Every resource of the newly restructured Shin-Yan Group, now a global leader in medical logistics and infrastructure, was channeled towards ensuring Amara's vision thrived. He was her silent engine, the dark gravity that allowed her light to shine. His obsession hadn't faded, it had matured into a soul-level partnership. He didn't need to mark his territory anymore, because the entire city knew who she belonged to, and more importantly, who he belonged to. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse into the gleaming hallways of the facility, Seung-jin stepped out of the shadows. He met Amara at the base of the grand staircase. The semi-sexually charged tension that had once defined their stolen hours in the penthouse was still there, a vibrant electric hum that only they could feel. "You did it, Amara," he murmured, his voice a low, possessive rasp as he took her hand. His thumb grazed the back of her knuckles, a familiar grounding touch. "The city finally sees what I saw in that alleyway." "We did it," she corrected, leaning into him for a brief private moment. "The man who was left for dead built a place where no one else has to be." Seung-jin looked up at the commemorative plaque near the entrance, the Bennett Park Foundation. It was a new vow, written in glass and stone rather than blood and ink. He pulled her into a long, quiet embrace that tasted of freedom and jasmine. Outside, the city continued its usual chaos, but inside the center, there was a new kind of peace, the dangerous, impossible, world-changing kind of love, the best kind. The ruthless boss had finally found his home, and the nurse had found her empire. As they walked together towards the executive wing, hand in hand, the shadows of the past were finally eclipsed by the dawn of their forever.